So
That's
you're
it.
not looking for a pedicure on the way up to the summit? That's not part of the goal?
Come on, what's wrong with
What's the matter with me? Yeah.
it?
Welcome to the Greens and Blues 14er podcast. This episode, Zach finally gets to talk shop. I throw softball questions all over the place, and we talk with Dr. Shaunna Burke of the University of Leeds in the UK about how and why we want to hike these big mountains. Well, Zach, today we're going to talk with Dr. Shaunna Burke of the University of Leeds in the UK. So she's a professor in exercise and health psychology. Why are we talking with Dr. Burke today?
Well, Eric, this is I'm glad you're asking this question. You're probably wondering this. Why does Zach want to talk to a sports psychologist?
At first, I asked that question. I thought, this is an interesting topic. But the more that I thought about it, and the more, so you and I read about some of her work ahead of time, the more I dug into that, the more I thought, this is fascinating. I was really looking forward to talking with her.
Yeah, I have noticed, Eric, as we've talked to some really distinguished people on this podcast, people who have done a lot of mountaineering, obviously Jennifer and Jerry Roach, Laura Clark, Justin Simone, the Collards, the Coonies. I have noticed as we've gone along that these individuals tend to have similar motivational profiles and similar personality types. They're highly driven, highly organized, generally pretty gritty people in the sense that they're willing to tolerate a high degree of discomfort.
Yep.
And I thought it would be really fascinating if we could talk to someone that, for lack of a better term, looks at these folks and thinks about what it is that motivates people and what kinds of psychological types they tend to be. This is the era where, people are always psychologically typing themselves. You and I have talked about our Enneagram types while we're hiking,
Yep.
or our Myers-Briggs, or we're not really going to do that today, but more of what does the research say about mountaineers? And that sent me on a quest. This has been 6 months in the offing here to find someone who's a really important, really distinguished sports and exercise psychologist. And that brought us to Dr. Shaunna Burke, who is our guest today. But the most wonderful thing happened as I started to read her work and then dig into who she is. This whole new world opened up of like, oh, wow, this is someone who not only studies this, she's actually a mountaineer herself.
She's doing it too. Yep.
And I was like, oh, wow, this is the most unexpected thing. We've got this person who's agreed to come on the podcast just because of their research. But the more I learned, the more I was like, oh, she's climbed Everest. She's done peaks in the Andes. She's done peaks in the Alps. She runs marathons. Not only does she study these people, she is one of these people.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so what I think we'll find in our interview with her, which I found completely fascinating, is that we're going to break it up into two parts. Part one today is really about Dr. Burke's research into kind of the motivational and psychological profiles of people that do mountaineering. And when she says mountaineering, she means not like what you and I do, Eric, like walking up.
We're walking. Yeah.
Yeah, we're doing glorified walking, and sometimes we bend over and have to tie our shoes. She's talking about mountaineers, people that hike big peaks. In particular, a lot of her subjects did Everest or are trying to do Everest. So that's really what we're going to focus on today, is that what the science says about those people. And then part two will be more about Shaunna's personal story as a mountaineer, as a survivor of breast cancer, and as someone who's preparing to go climb Mount Everest again in the coming months. I don't know, what did you think about our interview, just kind of as a preview for it?
Yeah. So you mentioned, I think you summarized it perfectly. She studies folks that want to get to very high summits. She also is a person that wants to get to a very high summit. And she is a super nice person to boot. Like, you add all that together, and it ended up being a really enjoyable conversation. I knew it would be kind of academically focused, but there was also a strong personal side to it as well. And, made all the easier by the fact that she was really relatable, really approachable. And yeah, it was a great conversation.
I mean, there's a subtext here, Eric. You got to let me nerd out once a year on this podcast. Like, I'm going to have to do that. I think what makes her great is that she's really aware this is not loaded with a bunch of academic jargon.
For
She
sure.
she keeps this to a level where I think all of us can kind of understand it. And I had this eerie feeling as she was going along, like, wow, she's describing me a lot. So um, maybe you guys will have that sense too. Just to echo you, Shaunna was an absolute joy to talk to,
Yeah.
joy to interact with. She gave up a lot of time. She's about a third of the way around the world. So we were talking to her when she was in England.
At the end of her day.
Yeah, at the end of her day and in the middle of ours. So
No, let's get into it. It's our pleasure to get to speak with Dr. Shaunna Burke, professor in exercise and health psychology in the University of Leeds in the UK. Dr. Burke, welcome to the Greens and Blues podcast.
Thank you very much, Eric and Zach, for having me on your show. I'm really, really excited to be here today and just have this opportunity to speak with you.
Awesome.
we are too, yeah.
Well, we wanted to learn more about the work you've done and the research you've done around how and why some of us want to ascend really big mountains. But before we dig into that, we'd love it if you could share some of your background, where you're from, and how you developed a passion for the mountains.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm originally from Montreal in Quebec, Canada. That's where I was born and raised. I actually grew up as an alpine ski racer, so I have a strong background in competitive skiing. Went to a sport academy, and I was really lucky as a youngster. I got the chance to ski 4 days a week and go to school 3 days a week. I grew up spending a lot of time in the mountains as a downhill ski racer. But my passion for mountaineering started when my skiing career came to an end. So I actually lived for 3 years in Nevada, in Lake Tahoe, where I accepted a skiing scholarship. And I did part of my undergrad at Sierra Nevada College, and then finished my undergrad at McGill University back in Montreal. When I finished my undergrad, I was at a loss for what to do next. And so a friend of mine and myself, we decided we were going to travel around the world for 6 months. And during our travels, we found ourselves in the Himalayas, in Nepal, where we did the famous Annapurna trek. And we had such a great time that we decided we would continue on. It was the time of year when climbers were on the mountain on Everest. So we decided we would do the famous trek to Everest Base Camp. And that is where the seed was planted for me in terms of wanting to get into high altitude mountaineering. And that's where my climbing career started.
Wow, that's an auspicious place to start a climbing career, or to think about it. So where did it go from there, Shaunna? Like, we're kind of focusing on hiking right now, and we'll get into your academic world in a minute, but where did you go from there in terms of alpinism and mountaineering?
Yeah, so I had already done some rock climbing and ice climbing, so I had some technical skills under my belt, but it was that trek to Everest Base Camp that inspired me to get further into the mountains and to go higher. And so from there, I spent a fair bit of time in the Rockies in Canada doing some climbing. And then from there, I went on to climb some other mountains around the world as I tried to gain experience climbing in high altitude. So I wanted to test myself to see if I was one of those people who could adapt to high altitude, because as we all know, it's not a given that everyone can physiologically adapt to high altitude. So I did Kilimanjaro. I've climbed Kilimanjaro actually 4 times. And I also climbed Mount Aconcagua in Argentina. I've climbed Elbrus in Russia. And then I've also climbed Mont Blanc as well. I did the traverse from the Italian side into France. So I spent a number of years in the mountains climbing, developing my skills, and getting experience that I needed to go back to the Himalayas and to climb Everest.
Wow. So that probably leads us to Everest. So around what time do you find yourself in Everest? And if you want to talk for a minute about your experience with the largest mountain in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've actually been on Everest 3 times. So my first time was in 2003. Now, we only had a permit to climb as high as Camp 2 on the mountain. I was part of a Discovery Channel mini-series expedition. So in 2004, I was invited to join the Discovery Channel team and to attempt the summit. So I was a main character in a 6-part mini-series. But in 2003, we wanted to capture some background footage on the mountain. And so that's why we had a permit to get up to Camp 2, was just to start capturing some footage. So that was my first introduction to Everest and climbing on the world's tallest peak. But then in 2004, I went back to attempt the summit with the team. And I got stuck in a windstorm up at Camp 4 in the death zone. Where I was unable to climb high, but I was also unable to come back down the mountain to safety. We were stranded for a couple of days in the death zone with the winds that were just pounding the side of the tent. You know, we were quite frightened. I was worried that the wind could actually get underneath the tent and blow it off the side of the mountain. So quite scary. But managed to retreat back down the mountain, which was difficult because the summit was so close. I could see it. I felt like I could touch it, but obviously I still had a ways to go, but had to turn around and come back down, but made the right call, safety first in the mountains. And then I had the chance to go back to Everest the following year in 2005. And that year I became the second Canadian woman to reach the summit.
Wow. Well, congratulations.
Yeah,
what an
seriously.
accomplishment. I'm counting. That sounds like you've also done 4 out of the 7 summits, if that's correct. But okay, so you're doing that, but there's a parallel life that you have while you're doing that, because you're also a research psychologist with an interest in mountaineering and an interest in psychological motivation behind mountaineering. So can you talk a little bit about how that interest is being fostered? And at some point, we're going to put the peanut butter and the jelly together here and talk about these things. But yeah, can you talk about that path in your life too?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I came back from the Himalayas after doing the trek to Everest Base Camp, I came back to start a master's degree. And my master's was in the area of sports psychology. And when I came back from the Himalayas, I had to choose my thesis topic. And having been so inspired by being in the mountains and having met Everest climbers when I was there, I was very fortunate to have actually met Eric Weinheimer, who was a blind climber at the time who was attempting the summit. And when I was there, he really inspired me, you know, watching him. We actually spent some time with him at base camp. And we actually got to walk with him from one of the tea houses to base camp. And it was just fascinating to see how he psychologically sort of managed the challenges that he faced. So he actually walked all the time with 2 climbers by his side. So he had 1 climber walking in front of him, ringing a bell for sound. And he had another climber behind him, sort of telling him where to place sort of each foot and just talking to him, supporting him. I was really, really moved by that. And he was so lovely with us. He invited us to join his expedition and to come in at base camp. And so when I got back to the University of Ottawa, where I was doing my master's and had to choose my thesis topic, I thought, I want to do it on the mental strategies used by elite mountaineers to overcome obstacles. I was just fascinated by garnering a greater understanding of psychologically how climbers face adversity and overcome it.
Yeah. So let's dive in on, that sounds like a great entry point. So you do your thesis and then you go on and you do, after you get your PhD, you do some more research on some of those ideas. First of all, let's define a term. When we talk about mountaineers, who are we talking about?
Right. Yeah. So there is a clear distinction, but as well as there is also overlap between hikers, trekkers, climbers, mountaineers, alpinists. So there are a lot of terms that are used out there, and sometimes they're used interchangeably when maybe there should be some clear distinction between them. But I think, you know, moving forward with this conversation, I think I would define mountaineers as those individuals who are intentionally setting out to achieve a summit, and they are in an environment that is either alpine or the high mountains, rugged terrain that often involves specialized skills and techniques and equipment. Not always, but often does. So there is that difference between, somebody who's maybe hiking where they're on a defined route, and therefore there tends to be less risk involved and less technical skill that is required compared to a mountaineer. I don't know if there's anything you would add to that, but that would sort of generally be sort of my take on it.
So, yeah, I mean, clearly Eric and I under that rubric are hikers, and, which I'm perfectly comfortable with. And when we talk about people doing Everest, we're talking like the tippy top of mountaineering, right? In terms of anticipated risk, incalculable risk, skills needed, physiological demand, all those things, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So when we start to look at, for lack of a better term, risk management strategies, psychological, I'm trying to reduce this to layman's terms here, coping mechanisms. Just the story you told about that gentleman with the person ringing the bell in front of them and somebody telling them how to walk. You start doing research into those different strategies that people employ. What did you find?
Yeah, so my PhD actually, so it evolved from the actual master's. So just to give you a little bit of background about my PhD, I actually used an ethnographic approach, which means that I climbed on the mountain with my participants so that I could be with them to observe their behaviors and at the same time to be able to conduct interviews at various points on the mountain. With ethnographic research, it's very about immersing yourself in the culture under study so that you have a greater appreciation for the culture and the cultural influences that are shaping participants' lived experiences. So my PhD involved climbing on the mountain with my participants, where I had the opportunity to observe their behaviors and conduct interviews. That particular study, I was looking at cognitive dissonance, and I was looking at how high altitude mountaineers make sense of their decisions in the mountains. So when we think about cognitive dissonance, essentially, it's when we hold to inconsistent cognitions that creates a sense of psychological discomfort within ourselves that we're then motivated to reduce. So to give you an example, you may see yourself as a very honest person, and yet one day you tell a white lie to one of your friends. That's going to create psychological discomfort within your mind that you're then going to be motivated to try to resolve. And there's numerous ways as human beings that we go about resolving that discrepancy. And whether it might be denial, it might be rationalization, it might be changing behavior. There's different ways we can do that. And so my PhD set out to look at how climbers make sense of their decisions when they conflict with a sense of self.
Can you give an example of what that might look like? What cognitive dissonance for an elite climber might look like?
So to give you an example, so maybe particularly this is often seen with maybe less experienced mountaineers who might not be as used to seeing dead bodies on Mount Everest. So, you may have a climber who comes across a body on the mountain, and that might create some discomfort within themselves just because of mortality salience and the awareness of death and dying. But where we see more classic examples, and they're often highlighted in the press, is when you hear about some climbers who might walk over or who might not stop to help another climber who is in need of support or is in need of help. That can create, a sense of discomfort or dissonance for a climber within their minds. And then it's how they go about resolving some of those behaviors or actions that they take when they're in an extreme environment and when they're deprived of oxygen. That when we think of high altitude, the brain is starved of oxygen, and climbers often, decision-making becomes more difficult. So that would be sort of one example that might create some dissonance for a climber, but it's in any situation really when you act in a way that conflicts with how you see yourself as a person. And so that there are numerous sort of examples, but that would just be one, I guess, on the more extreme level. And so I guess with my research, there's a number of things that I found. But if I go back to some of the early work with the mental strategies, what we did find was there are a number of psychological strategies that are needed to overcome obstacles on Everest. And I guess the biggest one is probably not the most surprising, but that's resilience or mental toughness. If you can think of an environment like Everest, there is a lot of psychological as well as physical discomfort that one has to endure. Lots of, cold temperatures. There's the high altitude, having to deal with symptoms and side effects. So headaches, shortness of breath, difficulty sleeping, difficulty eating. Climbers can lose anywhere between 20 to 40 pounds after an expedition because muscles atrophy, the body starts to, break down and waste away. So psychologically, it's that mental toughness that will help a climber persevere through that hardship and adversity. But there's also a number of other mental strategies that we identified as well.
So how does a mountaineer, for lack of a better word, create resilience? Like if it's a strategy, it means it's something that you're deploying unconsciously or consciously in order to mitigate cognitive dissonance, kind of work through that situation. How are they creating that resilience? I mean, you can't create it on the fly, I take it. There's got to be ways that they tap into that in their own minds and bodies, right?
Absolutely. Yes. So mental toughness is a trait, but it's also something that can be developed. And so there's different ways you can go about developing your mental toughness. So if we think of some of the physical discomforts that a climber might experience, they might decide that training in their preparation and lead up to Everest, that they, on the days when they're extremely tired to their core, they will force themselves to go out and to do their training anyways. Or on days when it's extremely cold, they will try to, push themselves through their sort of threshold of what they can tolerate, obviously safely. But it's about sort of pushing your body and your mind on that physical level, practicing it in training before going to the mountain. So when you go to the mountain, you're not taken off guard. You can say, my body's been here before. I know how to handle this. I know psychologically, I know how to dig deep, and I know I'm going to still be capable. So it is really about pushing yourself physically so that you develop that resilience when you're in the moment and you really need it.
This is a bit of an autoethnography question. Is that a strategy that since you've done this, is that a strategy you yourself have relied on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's numerous instances when I was on the mountain where I had to dig deep. And I think, on a number of levels, I think, on Everest with that discomfort physically that you experience with that, I remember in 2005, I suffered from the Kumbu cough. So that's quite common for climbers to pick up because the air is so dry, this dry hacking cough that's almost uncontrollable, where climbers have been known to actually break their ribs. It can be so bad. Now, that didn't happen to me, but I did suffer from that alongside other side effects, of high altitude that almost any climber will experience. And so for me, it was, digging deep in those moments and reframing the discomfort. So rather than seeing the discomfort as a threat, sort of leaning into the discomfort and saying to myself, okay, this is part of the Everest experience, and there are going to be side effects of high altitude, and trying to look at it in a way that I could lean into it rather than resist it. But I think the work that I did before going to the mountain, that preparation around building that mental toughness, just comes through putting myself on the mountain, on other mountains, on difficult mountains, testing myself on higher and higher peaks so that I could just build that reserve that I needed when I needed to draw on it.
Are there particular kinds or types of individuals that cultivate that better than others? I know that there's obviously cutesy pop culture ideas of like psychological types or personality types. From psychological perspective, as a researcher, are there different kinds of individuals that are more apt to cultivate that kind of resilience or mental toughness?
Yeah, I would say that there is a mindset to endurance and a mindset to managing discomfort. And so I think a lot of mountaineers, elite mountaineers, particularly those who climb the 8,000 meter peaks, They are individuals that very much are comfortable with uncertainty. When you think of the mountains, you can think about how much uncertainty coexists with mountaineering. You have changes in weather patterns. You know, an avalanche could happen at any point in time. Something could happen to one of your teammates, falls into crevasses. You know, there's numerous things that can unpredictable, unexpected that can happen in the mountains. And I think mountaineers tend to have a mindset of being comfortable with uncertainty and knowing how to adapt to change when it does happen, because I think that's quite key too, is that adapting to change and being able to do it quite quickly when you're in the mountains. Circumstances are constantly changing, like with weather patterns or the route that you're on. You may have to change course if there has been an avalanche. And so it's that mindset and that ability to say, okay, I'm capable of changing my mindset, reframing situations, and carrying on.
I'm curious, as we're talking about some of the skills, developing perseverance, developing mental toughness, being able to change on the fly and flex. In your research, Dr. Burke, have you found, I guess for lack of a better term, weaknesses that mountaineers typically have that may or may not have to be addressed on the mountain or beforehand? Are there any particular characteristics that you've noticed where mountaineers might struggle?
Yeah, I do actually. And I think a lot of mountaineers tend to be very extremely self-driven. And I think I'm going to use the word obsession, and it's not, maybe that is the wrong word, but I think the drive to reach the summit can be extremely strong for mountaineers. And you often see tends to occur more predominantly in less experienced mountaineers on Everest, where you may have heard of the term summit fever.
Well, we've heard of that term.
We're familiar with that one. Yes.
Even hikers get that, Shaunna. Yeah.
Okay, there we go. Excellent. Yeah, absolutely. And it's it's really understandable how it happens, because you've spent so many years, for some mountaineers, training years and years for a particular mountain, the level of commitment that goes into it, the financial commitment that goes into it, that drive and what it takes mentally and physically to get to the summit. It takes, for some individuals, it just takes everything, all their willpower. And so you often see it too on Everest. The closer the climber is to the summit, that's often when it kicks in, because they think, I've got it, I see it, it's there.
I can touch it.
Yeah, exactly. So I think there tends to sometimes be for climbers that difficulty in then goal adjustment or goal readjustment. So when we talk about goal setting in sports psychology, we know that it's absolutely fundamental that we have small goals which feed into our larger goal. And I think on Everest, I have seen where some less experienced mountaineers have placed their goal on getting to the summit, which on the surface would seem, all right, okay, that's your goal, right? To get to the summit. But your ultimate goal should be, it's getting to the summit, but it's returning to base camp safely.
Because when you're on the summit, you're only halfway there, right?
Yeah. Correct, exactly. And that's it. And I think, climbers can run out of their energy reserves that they need to then get themselves back down the mountain. If you think of climbing and you think of, if you've got a tank of petrol or gas in you, as you're climbing, that's going down, your energy is going down, but you need to save enough in the reserve to be able to get yourself back down the mountain. And you often, I think it's about 70% of the accidents often occur on the descent in mountains. So, it's so crucial to be able to still stay focused and have enough, energy to get back down. So I think that could be one example.
That holds true. That statistic even holds true in Colorado, or in the lower 48, like in Nevada, where you've been, or in those places. 70% of all rescues happen on the return. So yeah, boy, that opens up a bunch of interesting questions. Leads naturally to the question of, okay, why are people doing this in the first place? So we've talked about kind of strategies that people use to mitigate cognitive dissonance, maybe on the way, when they're there. You've talked about this kind of person that cultivates this, the type of person that may have this, that's flaw, for lack of a better word, of summit fever. But why would anyone, knowing the risks, particularly when we're talking about Everest, or even a more dangerous mountain like K2. Why would anyone want to do this? Or what's the motivation to do this? Because you've talked about some of the characteristics of those people. What's the motivation behind all this?
That's a great question. And I think for me, my interest in the motivation of elite high altitude mountaineers really does stem from this is a group of individuals who are performing on the very limits of human existence. So very much they're on that limit of where human life is sustainable, operating in an environment where risk is very high, discomfort and uncertainty are also very high, but also where mortality salience, so the awareness of your mortality, is very much part and parcel with the actual sport. And I think it's what makes me quite interested in motivation, because it's very much internally driven, because climbers are consciously placing themselves in that environment with very little external rewards. But when we talk about the actual motivation, I often think of Sir George Mallory, who attempted Everest a number of times, and reporters were just so eager to find out why. Why do you keep going back to Everest to attempt the summit, you know? And why do you keep putting your life at risk? And his very simple response was, well, because it's there. And I think in a way that really does sum up the motivation. For a lot of elite level mountaineers, it's internally driven, in that it's a passion that is so internal and deeply aligns with their values and the sense of who they are, that mountaineering becomes a form of self-expression. And I think it's very much about the meaning that climbers attach to the mountain. And I'm going to actually go back to meaning and give you an example that's just popped into my mind. So my very, very first study with cancer survivors in the mountains was actually conducted with a group of breast cancer survivors on Mount Kilimanjaro. And I did an ethnographic study where I climbed with this group of women. We spent 9 days on Kilimanjaro. We did the Ronge route, which takes a little bit longer, and we took our time. We wanted to make sure everyone was properly acclimatized. But I conducted interviews at various elevations on Kilimanjaro and did observations with the women as well. I wanted to understand what climbing the mountain meant to this group of women who had just endured treatment for breast cancer. And they were just starting out, so they were in the recovery, so they were in the survivorship period. And I wanted to know, what did climbing the mountain mean to them? And if you think of a mountain, basically a mountain is it's a piece of rock and ice, but it's what we as human beings attach to that mountain that drives us to move forward. And so for a lot of these women that I studied, they would say to me that climbing Kilimanjaro was a way for them to put closure behind their experience with breast cancer. They saw the mountain, every step they took up the mountain, as taking a step further away from breast cancer. So for them, very much, the mountain actually became a way for them to grow through their experience with breast cancer. So there's a theory called post-traumatic growth, which suggests that some of us can grow through adversity. Not everybody does, but some of us do grow. And we can grow in a number of ways. And Kilimanjaro was helping these women see themselves as strong, seeing themselves as capable. And so through their experience of pushing themselves physically and psychologically, it was helping them with their recovery after having gone through something quite difficult and very challenging. So I think when we talk about motivation, I think it's different for everyone. And I also think it's multifaceted. And I also think it's something that changes depending on where we are in our lives and what we're going through at a particular point in time. But we tend to see that more elite level, high altitude mountaineers are really driven by that intrinsic motivation, where it is the curiosity to find out if they're capable. It's the passion and the feelings that are associated with being in the mountains. And very much it tends to be about self-expression as well. I think one other point just to make about that, which I think probably spans across less experienced mountaineers, as well as hikers and climbers, is very much that sort of link to It'd be interesting to hear your point, actually, see what you think. But I think I'm talking more from mountaineers' perspective and less from hikers' perspective. But I think that there are spiritual, existential motivations that are aligned with being in the mountains as well. So I think mountains very much offer that place for silence, for solace, for perspective. I know for me, when I'm in the mountains, I have never felt so tiny and so small, but so connected to the environment and to nature. And there's something quite spiritual about that.
100%.
Yeah. So you used the word values a minute ago, and that's really kind of where I wanted to, you did it for me. I wanted you to kind of expand on that because, and I do want to get back to other values, but having read some of your studies, some of your subjects do have this spiritual value that they assign to it. These kind of oceanic feelings of being immersed in something bigger than yourself, this spiritual connection. Eric and I have done interviews with a bunch of people. I don't know if you know, but in Colorado, there's 674 peaks above 13,000 feet. And then there's a few more, about 54 more above 14,000 feet. And we've interviewed 6 or 7 people that have done all those peaks. So, 700 plus summits. And usually they're in the thousands, right? One of them is actually Jerry Roach, who's an elite mountaineer. He's done all the 7 summits, done the 16 highest in North America, done a bunch of 8,000 foot peaks in the Himalaya, done all the peaks in Colorado, so on and so forth. And he wrote a book called Transcendent Summits. And his experience early on is when he climbs a mountain, he has a transcendent summit. It's this sense of connection. It's kind of cosmic feeling of smallness and yet largeness, paradoxically. And I wanted to know, in your ethnographies, even with people doing Kilimanjaro, is this scalable? Do you find it not just in people that do Everest, but also breast cancer survivors on Kilimanjaro, or maybe Shaunna Burke climbing Mount Elbrus? Or do you find these feelings kind of all over the place?
I would say I can only talk from a personal perspective because my research was a bit more focused on theories of psychological well-being, post-traumatic growth, and cognitive dissonance. But I would say from a personal perspective, what you're saying about that transcendent experiences very much resonates. I think for me, there is something about being in the mountains that makes me feel more alive than anywhere else on the planet. And I think it's because it's a way to connect to something larger than yourself. And I think it often is a place for me where I can put life into perspective. And so it's a place for me where maybe the smaller things in life that you may dwell on become not as important when you're in the mountains. And so I think it's that sort of a perspective check, in a way. And, you come out of the mountains and you're a changed person because you do see things differently. And so for me, very much I would agree.
As someone that studies religion, that's what rituals do too. And oftentimes, as you probably well know, hiking and climbing are often quite ritualized in terms of how people negotiate it. But I'm also thinking too, I'm not going to make any claims about the age of the participants of this conversation, but you spoke earlier about kind of cultural influences that shape climbers. I do think there is something to the fact that people of our generation and maybe preceding us tend to talk about it more in those terms, that more romantic association, spiritual association with the mountains, just because we were influenced by literature and ideas about wilderness that really were abounding in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s about what wilderness was. It was this kind of sojourn from industrialized spaces and so forth. I'm wondering too, you talk about intrinsic motivation a lot. Do you see people that have extrinsic motivation when they climb mountains?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think extrinsic motivation, in one of the studies that we did, we compared, it was a very small sample size. So, it's difficult to make generalizations, but we did have 2 elite mountaineers who had climbed a number of 8,000 meter peaks. And then we had 2 novice mountaineers. And when we were looking at what was their motivation to climb, they tended to be, with the less experienced mountaineers, more extrinsic motivations to climb, driven by recognition, driven by external validation, driven by wanting to develop certain skills. But that's not to say that they also weren't driven by internal motivations as well. It just, we tended to see that there was a few more extrinsic motivation. And I think you can have both intrinsic and extrinsic, and sometimes the extrinsic will actually amplify or even, so support the intrinsic motivations. But I think when the conditions become really difficult and you're really stretched thin and you're sort of on the brink of, turning around, it's the internal drive that really just helps propel you and keep you moving forward. But yeah, definitely. I think the motives are multiple, and there are both intrinsic and extrinsic factors that drive people.
Do you see, having been on Everest, where now a lot of people are sponsored to do these expeditions? I know I'm asking you to make a non-academic generalization. Do you see more people that you think are motivated extrinsically by reputation, or they've got to pay the bills, like this is part of their brand, for lack of a better term, right? Do you think you see more of that?
I think Everest has changed significantly since I climbed it in 2005. I think it's a completely changed. Yeah, I would say the whole sort of culture of climbing Everest has changed on a number of levels, and that is one of them. But I think as well, if you think about the world we're living in now, where social media is playing a big role. So more and more now we're seeing where people are wanting to, showcase what it is they're doing and how they're doing it. And that is sort of becomes part and parts on Everest, I think, where, there's almost an expectation that people will be sharing, their experience in terms of what they're doing, which can take away a little bit from the sort of intrinsic. But I think we're seeing, less and less climbers who have that purist traditional, where it's just about going into the mountains for the mountains. And we tend to see that there are more extrinsic reasons for people going, such as, like you said, that recognition or sponsors that they do need to satisfy. So yeah, definitely.
Another non-academic question. How do you feel about that?
I think
you don't have to have an opinion on it if you don't want one, but I'm asking you to kind of give a hot take here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think nowadays it's quite difficult I think the world has become a lot more accessible, and it's much more difficult to find mountains where you can go off and be completely solitude, remote. The world has become much more, I guess, on the positive side, much more connected and much more accessible, which means that more and more people, obviously, if we put finances aside, you do it for Everest in particular, you have to have the financing. So it's not accessible to everybody, but I think it's become more accessible just because of the infrastructure now that goes around with it too. A lot more comforts for Everest climbers than, when I did it. And then even well before that, it's quite shocking actually now what could be available if you want to pay for it on Everest. Things like, coffee shops and getting a massage down at base camp kind of thing. And so for me, it goes against my ethos in terms of how I prefer to climb. But I guess everything in life changes, everything in life evolves, and I think we just need to find a way to make sure that the mountain is as safe for people as possible. Yeah, I suppose there's always going to be a fascination with Everest because it's the tallest mountain in the world, and I don't think that's ever going to change. So we just have to make sure that it's safe, and yeah.
So you're not looking for a pedicure on the way up to the summit? That's not part of the goal?
Come on. What's wrong with you?
What's the matter with me? Yeah.
So one of the things you found in a number of studies, and actually you cite other studies that find this too, is that these are words that I need deciphered. You found that elite mountaineers tend to be, quote, lower on scales of neuroticism, and I need to know what that means, and tend to be higher on scales of sensation seeking. And can you flesh those terms out and spell out the consequences of what that means in terms of a type of person that might do this kind of stuff?
So I guess when talking about elite mountaineers generally being lower on neuroticism. Mainly what the literature is saying is that it's not that elite mountaineers don't feel fear or that they don't feel anxiety. It's that they're generally less reactive to it. So generally speaking, they tend to show up on the mountain as exhibiting sort of a level of steadiness. And that's probably what's linked to the mental toughness in a way, is that when they're under pressure or they're in situations that are very ambiguous, they don't tend to react to those situations in a rash or uncontrolled way. They're able to keep that level of calmness or steadiness so that when they make decisions, they're making decisions that are based on coming from a place of not being anxious or not an anxious place. So that's sort of what the literature is saying.
What about sensation seeking? Mountaineers are less neurotic in those terms, like they don't attend to their feelings of fear as strongly as others, perhaps. What does sensation mean, which is more elevated in those kinds of individuals?
Yeah, so a lot of the early research focused on sensation seeking and found that mountaineers tend to be those individuals who are driven to experience thrill, or they want to experience pleasure or heightened senses, heightened feelings that they're seeking when they go into the mountains and they're putting their lives at risk. They tend to be driven by those particular sensations. And our work did find that on one level, but I think very much when we talk about it in that way, again, I think it's going back to their conscientiousness in that climbers very much go into mountaineering as being very planned, very rigorous, very much you will try to, like if I think about when I went into the mountains, it's putting contingency plans into place. And it's those contingency plans when you go on the mountain that help you maintain that stable mindset so that you aren't reactive to sort of what's going on around you.
Mountaineers tend to be more sensation seeking, but they also have these other strategies to kind of reduce cognitive load, as it were, to make it not seem as dangerous or as threatening as you would normally find it, right? Like, so you've got all these things in place that give you a sense of comfort when you're doing that.
Yeah, so I guess it's that distinction between sort of being reckless versus being selective, and I think, elite mountaineers have sort of honed their skills around, yes, these sensations that they want to experience are part of it, but it's done in a controlled way where they're not being reckless with their decision making.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
A kind of follow up to that, and a follow up to Eric's question from about 15 minutes ago, but what cognitive biases do we see in mountaineers? So when I think of summit fever, which you mentioned a minute ago, I think of, this is a term from philosophy or from investing called sunk cost fallacy, which is like, I've put in all this work, I've done all these things, I've trained for so long, I did a marathon last year, I've endured all this. I can't go back now, man. Like, I can't give up now. I can't do that. I've got so much in this. Summit fever seems to me to be sunk cost fallacy, just kind of on an existential level, like you're actually threatening yourself. Do we see other cognitive biases, fallacies that climbers tend to kind of fall into?
So this would be based not on my specific research, but just more of my reading around the area. And I would tend to agree with you. So I suppose linked to what I was saying earlier about the summit fever and those climbers who have invested so much time and energy into training, finding it difficult then to turn around and adjust their goals. So going on to that sunk cost fallacy, as you were saying, I think sometimes you can see overconfidence in climbers, some climbers as well. I don't want to say this is you see this generally, but you can sometimes see some climbers might be overconfident in their ability, and then that can lead to them taking greater risks, and those risks potentially even cost them their lives. I think as well, which you see in many different sports or many different domains of life, full stop, Sometimes you see that social or peer pressure. So, when you're in a group and you're not climbing on your own, you're climbing with teams, and the team is carrying on. You don't think it's the right decision to go, but you go anyways because, the guide has said it's okay to go, or everybody else is going, and you just sort of follow along. So I think you sometimes do see that in the mountains as well, like you would see in other contexts.
We'll continue talking with Dr. Burke in 2 weeks as we dig more into her personal side, including her fight with breast cancer. In the meantime, if you would like to reach out to us, we'd love to hear from you at greensandbluespodcast@gmail.com, or the multiple ways that you can get a hold of us through our website, which is greensandbluespodcast.podbean.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.